Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us at this time here in the Bruno Kreisky Forum. Today we have a real science star, intellectual star with us, and it's a particular pleasure to welcome you, Professor Richard Sennett, here to Vienna. Of course, it's not the first time here in the Kreisky Forum, not the first time in Vienna, so, and I hope it won't be the last time. So really a warm welcome to Professor Sennett.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Robert Misik is going to be the moderator and being questioning and asking Professor Sennett. Thank you very much for joining us and doing this today, this evening. Let me introduce not Professor Sennett. This will be up to Robert if Professor Sennett needs an introduction at all, by saying that you were one of the major sources when I was a student of political science, and I remember very well. Oh. In the 90s, when I studied political sciences, we were obliged to read the book The Fall of Public Man, Verfall und Ende des öffentlichen Lebens. And since this is not the book you will be talking about this night, I allow myself to give a small quote in the first page of this book, because I still believe that what I've learned then about the fall of public man and public discourse and is still valid today. The reigning belief of today, says Professor Sennett in the first chapter actually, the reigning belief of today is that closeness between persons is a public good. The reigning aspiration of today is to develop personality through experiences of closeness and warmth with others. The reigning myth of today is that the evil of society can all be understood as evils of impersonality, alienation, and closeness. The sum of these is an ideology of intimacy, related to the profound dislocation which capitalism and secular belief produced in the last century. I do firmly believe that the identity discourses we find ourselves in today, and even what social media tries to tell us that it could achieve, namely the many friends and likes we might have, are also based in this myth of closeness and intimacy. So the fall of public man is probably a result of a long history and has started many, many decades, or at least decades before. So I would like to also mention that in the Anglo-American context, discussion about theories and theses is is also a public good. It's maybe also a myth that this is what makes us basically better informed, and so we would like to really ask you and encourage you all to join in a very vivid and discussion after this session. And here I stop, say a warm welcome again, wish you an interesting and for sure inspiring evening. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Mr. Sennett. Enjoy the evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sabine, for this introduction, and thank you, everybody here in the room, friends of the Bruno Kreisky Forum, to join us in this evening here. And also I say a warm welcome to everybody on the in the digital spheres who are watching us on their computers or wherever. Mm-hmm. And a very warm welcome, for sure, I reserve for Richard Sennett. Richard, it's wonderful that you are here again in the Kreisky Forum.
Well, I'm very glad to be back. Almost every time I come to Vienna, I've spoken here, so this is...
I for myself have had the honor to have you here and have the honor to moderate you and the lectures with you in 2008, and afterwards also in 2010. It was our Kreisky anniversary conference. I looked at that today. And so again, 16 years, 17 years later, here we are again. Richard is a great analyst of our times, of the present, and also of the presence of the last 50 years already. Much of his work also seems familiar in a way, because it became more and more common sense, because what Richard sensed, it became something like a common knowledge. Sabine already mentioned, I will mention some, in our talk, some works of Richard, for example, The Hidden Injuries of Class. We will talk a little bit about later. In the 19th also, as the neoliberal capitalism was still seen of something like a liberation, Richard, with the corrosion of character, already adopted a critical tone, which is common knowledge in a way today, but he sensed it very early, and I could go on with all of that, but I don't want, because then I would speak 10 minutes about that. So for sure today we want to speak especially about this book, which is called in German Der darstellende Mensch.
Yeah,
and in English it's called The Performer, and we talked a little bit before, because I had the assumption that it's the spontaneous association with the German title is the performing man, so that's we and everybody. And with the English title, The Performer, maybe the spontaneous assumption would be the artist as a performer. So is this a good ambiguity? Because both is part of your book, or is it a foolish question?
Well, never a foolish question. First, let me say I'm so glad to, as I say, this is always where I come when I come to Vienna. So these are rather dark times, and it's so I'm glad to be back here. I think you are more fortunate than you know, if I can put it that way. What this book is about is basically it has an autobiographical resonance to it, and it is a general resonance. And the autobiographical resonance is simply that I began my life as a professional musician. So, and when I stopped, I'm a cellist, and was a cellist. And when I stopped playing in public, it, of course, didn't leave me. And throughout my life, I've been interested in the relationship between the kind of performing an art that we do and everyday performances and political performances. What was that connection? And it's always been in the back of my mind. And so now that I'm getting old, I thought it's either now or never. The general point about this is that performing as one of the three basic expressive tools which all of us as human beings have. The others are narrating, storytelling, and imaging, making images. These three ways, in my view, are like the DNA of expression that we have. And what they do is they transform, say, an intellectual idea, which could be logical and so on, into something which is felt by other people. We have to perform often things rather than just say them. We have to tell stories about things to engage other people. We have to find images that relate to a meaning. And the idea of these, if I live long enough, I'm going to write 2 more of these books, one on storytelling and one on imaging. Well, you never know. It's one thing about the becoming 82 that I've discovered is that you could go on or not. But I think I will see this through. And the idea about it is that these are tools that we have for arousing ourselves and other people, which can be used for good or for evil. And that performances, as we see now in the United States or in far-right movements here, can be used for evil, but it's a tool that can also be used for good. And so I wanted to understand in these books, and in this one particularly, what is it about activities of performing that can be used in this way? What is it that allows them to be in everyday life something that is destructive or constructive? And that's one axe of this book. And the other axe of it, this way, is, of course, I was interested in the relationship between performing in everyday life, which we do when we go shopping with our family, our children, and so on, and the performing that artists do. And the argument in the book is that it's not a seamless connection, and that there's a disjunct between the kinds of performances people do in the everyday world and the performances that people like me used to do on stage, that there's a disjunct between art and life. Not a very popular position these days, where we want to see a kind of continuity. So that's basically what I'm onto in this book.
So this book is about a lot of things which are connected but not necessarily the same. So let's start, or let's stick a little bit before we talk about the political performer, which is for sure a very...
Do you think we could talk about that without mentioning the name Trump? I'm so sick of it that, there must be some way we can...
There are other names we can mention, but we do it later because let's stick to the artists for some minutes. In contrast to the author or the composer, the performer presents what somebody else created. So the performer is not the creator, but in a way the performer is a creator too, isn't he?
I don't think I agree with you. It's not ab novo, but one of the peculiarities about, well, a musical performance, for instance, is that what's created is basically a set of ink blots. They're just notations. They're not sounds. And when we begin doing the work of actually performing, we're trying to span a language into another language, which takes something which is basically a visual representation and make it auditory. Rather than, the old idea about this, the 19th century idea about this was that the performance was a kind of dramatization of the performer's feelings. Liszt suddenly being inspired and all of it. Forget all of that. But there's still the issue that, and it's very, if you are musical, and I assume everybody in Vienna is highly musical, you'll know that the problem is that the mind is doing something, inverting essentially, which is a set of just ink spots into something that's sound. So, for instance, I used to perform the Bartók quartets, very difficult piece of music, not least because what you intuit, say in the fourth quartet, are sounds that can't be written down. You know they're there somehow. But the notation, fourth quartet, it's also true, the fifth quartet too, is, and Bartók knew this, it has a kind of limit. So that's why I don't think I don't quite agree with you about this, that we're enacting something which is ready to be.
I not share my opinion too, because this was kind of my question. But the question now I would add to that, because you talked very much now about the performer in music. But how's with the performer as an actor who is acting in a play? Is it the same?
To me, it is. Yeah. I mean, the problem is the word creative suggests something that the old Greek was for poiesis. Mm-hmm. Was where there was nothing, suddenly there's something. Mm-hmm. And that's a very romantic idea of creation. What you have is a set of indications. I mean, this is a very complex issue, which I get into the book about what happens to the ego in that. If I thought that, it was the Bartók poor thing, didn't, have the language that he needed, how much of my ego was put into doing that? And the irony is, the less ego, in my view, the less ego you have about dealing with this transposition between languages, the more creative you are with that. And it's a view that goes back to Diderot's paradox of acting, which is that you aren't expressing yourself, nor are you expressing Bartók. You're creating something which is like a translation. Mm-hmm. A good translation of a poem is also always a new poem. Mm-hmm. So that's, and that bears on the political aspect of this, because political performing, heaven knows, is the ego is deeply engaged. And it's, so that's why I say it's not an easy transition from the kind of performances we do in everyday life, or the performances we do as politicians, or they do as politicians, and what we do as artists. I give another example of this from Diderot. Do you know this book, The Paradox of Acting? It's such a wonderful text, which was written in 56, something like that. He asks himself this question. If a performer were full of fire, full of himself, deeply passionate about what he or she was about to do on stage, they'd only be able to do this once. That they would be boring by the fifth performance. They could never tour, because after the 30th performance, they would have given it all away. There's nothing there. So that one of for Diderot, part of the art about performing is to learn how, and this is it's malign in a way, how to arouse others by not becoming aroused yourself. I give you an example of this, another musical example of this. Sometimes in performing, it happens to us that we just start crying. That's a very bad sign. That's a terrible sign. That means that probably this is going to be a crummy performance because we're overwhelmed with it. So that's another way in which this continuity, supposed continuity between art and life breaks down. And it's one of the things you learn from in the preparation and the musical performing, and I imagine it's the same thing in stage work, is how to stop feeling something like that so you're overwhelmed by what you're doing yourself. So that's
There's
another
a whole tradition of theater theory and theater praxis, how to get the distance to the role, the psychological theater, but also afterwards the Brechtian V effect, to have a real definite distance to the role, till the modern post-dramatic theater, where the figures are no figures anymore, but transporteurs of a text.
Right.
So, yeah.
But you know, with Brecht, the interesting thing about this is that this alienations theater, I don't know how you say it in German, is something where the audience is also learning that. You know, in a text like The Good Woman of Sichuan, I don't know how you say that in German.
A gute Mensch von Sichuan.
Yeah. By the end of it, the audience is supposed to be going, well, come on, really? This is absurd. And taking that distance, you'll be able to understand what's happening on the stage. If only he weren't such an unpleasant human being. There was so much about Brecht, which was a deep understanding of how theater worked. It's very hard, I found, to... I've tried to have, when I teach musicians, have them read Brecht theory, and what gets in the way is his obnoxiousness. But the theories are, this is a fundamental break between art and life.
Yeah. To come step by step from the arts to the everyday life and also to the politician's life, there is this famous phrase, we have it in German in the translation, die ganze Welt ist eine Bühne. It's the Shakespeare quote from As You Like It, all the world's a stage and all the men and women are merely players. This is already a phrase that assumes that what is happening on the stage is not too much different between what is happening in the everyday life and what we as not actors are doing in our everyday life. And there are also, there's also the question, what is political on arts? Because there are some demands to the arts, and these are political demands already. And you mentioned it also in your book, that the arts have to be directly political, that they should have political messages, or if they are not in that way directly political, that they have to be accessible, which is also a political demand, because it's a political demand from the system of the value system of equality. And you are criticizing the demand that the arts have to be accessible. Yeah. Because it shouldn't be too easy. It shouldn't be too easy.
Just to wind back a little on this, there are many issues you raise here, as always. This is the most famous quote in Shakespeare, to me it's the most famous quote, which is that all the world's a stage. But the speech is not quite what you think it's about. Yeah. The speech is not quite that everybody is an artist, because what it portrays the ages of 7 ages of men and women, and that in each generation they act out the same roles, that there's no difference between you and your grandchildren when they're middle-aged. You will behave the same way. And then you'll die, they'll do that, they'll die, and somebody else would take on. So it's about the kind of fixity and of the role-playing that we do. Historically, what's interesting about this is that this is the age in which, for instance, in Commedia dell'arte, which I think Shakespeare knew very well, in which the idea is that you play with a role that's familiar to people. So I give the example in the book of Dottore. Do you know this Commedia dell'arte, with the big nose and so on? It has a source in everyday life which is familiar and recognizable to everyone, which is that doctors wore plague costumes, in which these long noses, and they had hoods and so on, and they wore black gowns so that they could deal with people with plague and didn't fall ill themselves. And there's a version of this where Jewish doctors, who were the majority of doctors in Venice, for instance, the Merchant of Venice, also had a kind of were given a kind of bird-like mask with this long beak, with the beak that went like this, in order to signify that this wasn't a real human being that was looking at your vagina or looking at the boils on your foot. Then it's a kind of distancing mechanism. Anyhow, what's interesting about that is that in Commedia dell'arte, then they begin to play with this. Dottore is kind of sort of like a Jewish doctor who's stupid. They begin improvising all sorts of jokes in Commedia dell'arte that have to do with the nose. And part of the pleasure for people when they saw Commedia dell'arte was just the opposite of what Jacques says in As You Like It, which is you're seeing something you don't see in everyday life. And that's one of the interesting things about role-playing in everyday life and on this stage. In everyday life, role-playing works because it's recognition. You know what somebody's doing. That's the irony in that speech. Mm-hmm. You know, if somebody's playing the role of being your best friend at work, but they're actually stabbing you in the back, you understand what that role is about, unfortunately. But it's something that's clear. But on the stage, you will begin to play with that so that it isn't recognizable, and you become aware of something being generated artistically. So I'm sorry, this is a long disquisition on this, but it's such a complicated subject. So when this gets into politics, I will mention the name Trump now. Yeah. Okay. What gets into the art that someone like Trump, the art of acting that he does, is that he takes a lot of expectations of how a politician ought to behave and twist them so that you're going, my God, what's that about? For instance, what the wanderings that he has, you know, where these threads, you know, where he seems to be in this condition of almost Alzheimer's-like drift from one thing to another. It's something that's very arresting to people. I felt it. I've gone to several Trump rallies. It's very arresting because you don't know what's happening. You don't have a politician make an argument to you. You have something else going where the normal thing where he wants to convince you, vote for me because I've got the right ideas or whatever, suddenly becomes what's happening with him. And that kind of deformation of the received, of the ordinary, is what gives those performances their power. And they are artistic in that way, because they are just like, they are versions of Commedia dell'arte in which you're playing with an expectation and deforming it.
You are also quoting in your book from Machiavelli, The Prince, that he argues that rulers must be actors. So, given that what you said before, is every politician an actor, and is Trump also an actor, but who changes in a way the expectations only to the role?
Well, Machiavelli's idea, which is half Trump and half not Trump, is that what in front of the public, in front of us, what the prince does, the politician does, is you can never understand really what he's about. He inspires love and fear. You never know when he's going to attack you, when he's going to embrace you, and so on. So it's just that being thrown off balance. But Machiavelli's politician behind that is a rational actor.
And is Trump?
Hardly. But he's self-interested. I mean, the thing about, as we're learning about Trump, is that he's a very clear set of the reason he's so entwined with the Russians is that the Russians, as now appearing, own a lot of the Trump properties. He's lending money and so on. So there's a reason for that. But for Machiavelli, it's something that if a politician said to you, this is what I really think, you'd throw him out. If a politician said to you, well, it's time now to spend maybe 8–10% of our resources on arming ourselves against Russia. That's a politician who is about to sink, because it would be too difficult for people to. He says in Mandragola, which is a play that Machiavelli wrote, he said people can't bear too much truth. And that's, for him, that is the organizing principle of why you pretend like this in public. In order that you can do these things that people are not capable of doing if you told them the truth. There's a very interesting, I'll just say one more thing about this. There's a very interesting book by my teacher, Hannah Arendt, on lying in politics. And this conundrum tortured her. I mean, she was capable of being tortured by things that you and I probably would just have a drink and go on with. But this tortured her. The notion that rationality has to hide itself in order for power to be exercised. There's a little book called On Lying. I don't know what it's called in German, and I didn't even know if it's translated in German.
I think it was recently.
Recently, huh? Yeah. This is a wonderful text, and you can see her struggling with this Machiavellian proposition, and we all struggle with it. You know, as I say, with the, you know, it's clear to us that, you know, we're in a very different political world than we were even 5 months ago, and that we're going to have to do things which are very, very difficult. And the reactions are, well, somehow we can manage this. You know, that's a rejection, very human. You know, people can't bear too much of the truth about the situation we're faced with now. So that's a Machiavellian proposition. His prince is ultimately a good guy. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, he's rational. He wants to defend Italy against the French invasions and so on. He's basically okay, but he has to be a real bastard in order to do what's right.
Going away a little bit from Machiavelli, but sticking to the question if every politician has to be in a way an actor, which is obviously clear that he has to be. But on the other hand, these right-wing radicals, they are actors in some special ways. Especially if we take figures like Berlusconi, Jörg Haider we had here, Boris Johnson also, and now Trump. They are not only politicians that are acting in a role for political reasons, they are showmen. Right. So what's special with them?
Very good question. I've come to think that what's special about them is that what they are performing is something that people can identify with, which is you can be self-interested, you can be shameless, you can be somebody without dignity and still get away with it. Mm-hmm. And that's certainly with Boris Johnson and with Trump. I don't know about Haider, but certainly in the Anglo-Saxon world.
But Berlusconi, you know
better. Berlusconi, of course, yeah. And what's at play there, I think, which is subtle, is the uses of irony, which is, I know that you know that I'm having you on. That when I say, yeah, I'll solve the first day I'm in office, I'll solve the war, and don't worry about it. You know, that's not taken literally by nobody. None of his public believe that, but they believe that, you know, it's a kind of complicity of oh sure, you're going to solve Ukraine today. Lie to me, but lie to me, you know.
But it's a funny thing, because the normal politician, he tries that nobody can find out that he is lying, and it's a problem for him if people realize he is lying.
Exactly.
Nobody has a problem with Trump lying because he expected.
It's part of the performance.
Yeah, it's part of the performance.
And because you're in on it, you feel.
It's part of the what the audience and the leader
are all
hold them together.
Yeah, bonded together in this kind of sharing of a fiction. And also of something that is not noble, is not good-willed. Something that is where you can identify with somebody who is a bastard, you know. That's particularly true with Boris Johnson. It struck me during the COVID thing that, you know, they constantly had parties in Downing Street while the rest of us were locked away in our houses with our dogs going, let me out, you know, all of that. the reaction to that about in the press about the exposure of these parties was, oh, Boris, that's Boris being Boris, you know, which is a way of saying we're all in on the joke. You know, what applies to you doesn't apply to him, and it actually worked for a couple of months.
The $100 million question is, why do this kind of politicians have such a success now and not 20 years ago? What changed?
It's a good question. I don't know the answer to it. It's a very good.
I'm sorry for putting forward the
question.
question.
No, but why do you think that is? Because it's a question I simply don't understand.
Yeah.
It's, Berlusconi would be, in the age of Mussolini, Berlusconi would be in jail. It's unthinkable that somebody like Trump could have flourished in the time of FDR or Kennedy or something like that. But why do you think that is? Since you asked me this question, I don't know the answer.
I think it's. I would assume it's not a one issue answer or a monocausalistic answer. Yeah. One would be a change in media, in the media life, and some other reasons are reasons you touched already some decades ago in your books. I would say an alienation of a lot of people from the political system or from the traditional parties, feeling that they left them. Experience of humiliation.
Yeah, those are all elements.
Yeah.
What it doesn't explain, if I may say so, we've known each other a long time. What it doesn't explain is the notion that the clown factor, as we would say in English. Do you all remember with Berlusconi when he'd have these so-called political speeches, but he was surrounded by nearly naked women? You remember those things?
Bunga bunga.
Bunga bunga, yeah, right. You know, self-humiliation doesn't begin to describe it, but everybody's in on the joke. So that's an element which doesn't quite fit the notion of alienation. You know, it's something. Now, I'll tell you another thing I don't understand and I don't talk about in this book, which is a great failing of this book. I'm allergic to high tech. I don't understand why my grandchildren are on these bloody cell phones 4 hours a day. I can see what it's doing to them, which is it's making them social isolates. But what's not in this book, what's missing in it, is it's all about live performance. It's not about, or film performance as well, but it's not about the very peculiar effect that social media is having on politics. And I'm not sure.
And also not on training the people to perform their lives, because they perform their lives also in social media.
Yeah, but in a very strange sort of way. When somebody, I watched with horror with my grandchildren when they do this TikTok, these are little dramas, right? But the notion is there's no audience. Because if you have 6,000 performers, viewers, followers, whatever they are, who are they? You don't see them, they see you, but they don't really see you because they can cut you off at any moment. There isn't a kind of that kind of tension of live performance. So that's, I warn you in advance, this is a failing of this book. It doesn't explain because I don't understand it.
For sure, it's a very important element of the issue, of the theme.
Absolutely.
But you don't have to have everything in a book. That's not necessary. That's necessary. What you also have. We talked already about that. For sure, we all know that we are playing roles in our everyday lives, and that it's something distinguished from the actor that playing roles. But I would have one question to that about you, to you, because many people would say, "Oh, it's a problem that we playing roles and we are forced to playing roles in the public life because playing roles means that we are not ourselves." And that we are alienated from our real self.
Right.
So what do you think about this argument?
Well, this goes back to what I was saying to you in the beginning. This is a tool. It's not the fact that you're playing a role which is alienating to a person who does it, but the nature of the role that you're playing. The fact that you're acting is something that's human. It's a tool. If the role you're playing is a very bad one, you are you're alienated by it. One of the things that I have noticed about, because I started researching that with my students when I wrote The Corrosion of Character, one of the effects that online work has had on most people is that their roles have become more and more rigid. They have less and less control of their online behavior. So that's alienating, you know. But it's the nature of the role that you have. You have a command. It's, for a lot of tech work, you're timed. How fast can you perform a certain action? If you were in a call center, for instance, you have very little freedom in those roles. You can't be a commedia dell'arte performer. So that's the issue here. And when people contrast, I know you don't mean it, but when you make the contrast between authentic and role-playing, you've moralized an issue falsely. And think about this in another context, and this is the other big issue in my book. It's a very small book. I cut this book by 2/3, and I regret every moment of having done so, but that's modern publishing. But think about this in another context. Religion is all those rituals are role-playing, you know? There's nothing inauthentic about that. You know, a prayer is not something that's inauthentic, but it certainly is a role. So this can't be right to think about authenticity as something which is denuded from performing, nor from storytelling. You know, which was, there was a certain point, this is a rather arcane thing, but there was a certain point, there was this group of language philosophers in Britain who said, well, storytelling is an exercise in deception. And an authentic statement is not a story. Now I know this is way off thing, but it's the same mistake that we make more often when we make this opposition between playing a role and being your real self. One of the things that I loved about when I was working as a musician was the fact that most programming would not be like playing all the Bartók string quartets in 2 goes, which was also a source of alcoholism, I think, for most players who did this. It's unbelievable. What I loved was the fact that you had this quick roll switch. You played a piece of Bach, you played something modern, and then you played something romantic era. That's role playing, where you're playing different roles. There's nothing inauthentic about it.
Yeah, and this is not only a question or an example from the musician world. Yeah, that's the experience we have in our everyday life. We're playing different roles in the world, as in your families, with our friends, when we meet people from the government, when we go to a demonstration or whatever, and it doesn't mean that we are split persons and unauthentic. We can raise ourselves by playing different roles.
Yeah. But that was something that became, I think, in the 60s and 70s, that became an opposition. That somehow that playing different roles was something that was inauthentic. You should be a self that's coherent and the same in all your relations.
Important is if we have whether we have the authorship of the script of ourselves.
Yes, well, which goes back to the commedia dell'arte thing, or our problem of, because we are authors, in translating those ink blots into sounds. Yes, exactly. I mean, that's what I'd say about this as maybe this is, and then we can talk among the audience.
I have one question.
Okay.
More, but
well, what I'd say about this in general is that I'm very allergic to the kind of moralizing of art. And that's something, and on the positive side as well. I don't think, no matter how much Bach you play, it's not going to make you a better human being. I just don't believe that. And but the negative of that, of course, people will say, well, it is just a tool, but almost all of the kind of criticism certainly in the musical realm, that we're seeing is about something that we're seeing it, for instance, in ways of looking at the role of gender in performance. It's a terribly important subject, but the notion that a female performance is authentic or good, whereas a male performance is domineering and awful, is really to demean women performers, because you've ascribed them in that kind of moralizing universe. And I just think we have to free the arts from this, so that we're free, to do bad things as well as good things in art.
My last question would be to come back a little bit. We talked already about Trump and the showman figures and their success and what happened in the last 30 or 20 years. My last question would go a little bit more to the past, to the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s. You wrote this legendary book, The Hidden Injuries of Class, which is a shame because it's not translated to German till this day.
Really?
It isn't. Obviously it's not. I looked for it.
Wow. Now that's immoral.
There you had this sense. You had already a sense, but I asked you also for these new cultural splits that now dominate our political debate and intoxicates our political debates already. And maybe you remember, you wrote it 50 years ago, I'm not sure if you remember totally exactly. But you also have this example of Mira and Dolly and other friends, 6 female friends from the working class, I think from Chicago. They know each other from the kindergarten already, and one of them, she made it the upward mobility, and she is the modern person, and she also has the modern values. On the other one, I think it was Dolly, she was the more traditional, conservative, working class person. She's also a little bit bigot and not so cosmopolitical and not so anti-racist like Mira was. And she already knew that she had old-fashioned values, and that that Polly is looking down on her. So there's this humiliation between this class, and very interesting is also that they are having their dispute in front of you, and you are the
I explained a little about
scientist, and they want to be good in your eyes, and this is like a play also, as you describe it in the book.
It was a bit. I just explained to you what this was. When we first saw in America in 1968 the appearance of working class, right-wing working class figures who were very popular with working classes. George Wallace was one of them. Actually, I talk about him in this book. And I and the people I was in my laboratory then went out and interviewed 100 or so families from the white working class who sort of fit this profile. And it's an in-depth, it's what any anthropologist would do. And one of the things that we found in it was that the notion about feeling ashamed because you remained in the working class and weren't upwardly mobile was a profound driver of very right-wing behavior. The puzzle to me is that that's still true, but additionally to it, that people who are successful, and this is true both in Britain and the United States, are drawn to these far right-wing movements, which are movements about anger, about being denied, and so on. At one Trump rally that I was at, you looked out into the car park, and there were all these enormous new cars, you know, visible signs of people with wealth, big cars, you know, well cared for and all of this. And these were people who, thanks to Trump's power as an actor, took on the role of being, we're being excluded by elites, you know, we can't pay our groceries, all of this. So that's something, what I wrote about there, I still feel is a driver for many people to the far right. This notion of being left out or left behind. But the added thing is that you can generate that sense of being left out, of being angry. It's something where economics is not enough alone to explain what's happening. That's what I'm trying to say about this. And it's similarly these urban-rural split. People pointing to Austria, it's often taken as a prime case. You know, Vienna is left, and the rest of Austria is somewhere out there on the right. That doesn't work anymore either. So that's also it's a real conundrum to understand that moving away from this book about the thing that is most puzzling to me about the situation that we're in today is that this kind of symbolic anger, and it's intense, this feeling of being left out, is something that has invited almost no criticism from the left. They point to how stupid this is, you know, but not to try and understand, it's a puzzle, how you can drive a whole society in very different societies to the point where people actually want, the majority feels that what they want to do is take the society apart. And that goes back to the kind of irony thing that there's no reality out there. There are no consequences for that. And what I would say to all of you, which you know as well as I do, that'll be fatal to us. If these far right come in and we get into that world of symbolic anger and retribution and so on, we'll become our culture will become very weak, and our countries will become very menaced. It's the one thing that I've understood about Trump in these last 2 months, which is and you saw it if you followed this thing with the expose of the plans for bombing Yemen, is that there's incredibly militaristic talk among people who haven't really any desire to act militarily. And so the United States has become it's becoming weaker and weaker, in fact, under Trump. But maybe they can afford that. We can't, you know, unless you want to speak Russian, you know. But these forces they're now that are converging on us, where this kind of symbolic, enacted, dramatized forms of feeling left out, of being angry at people who are so-called cultural elites. That's a disaster for us as Europeans. Just a disaster. And anyhow, that's my worry.
But maybe we are able to deal with that too, because you also said at the beginning that we don't know how lucky we are in Austria and Vienna.
You are.
And at least we are lucky enough didn't get a right-wing extremist prime minister, which was very probable that we do two months ago. So in a way we are very lucky because we don't. But at that point, I want to stop with that, and thank you, Richard, for having this talk with me till this for this 1 hour here on the floor. And now I will shut up and only giving the floor to audience to come in a dialogue with you.